how much is it going to cost? Not just to build your no-code app, but to launch and maintain and grow it long term. That's what we're going to talk about in this video, because by this point, you have likely already considered the costs you're going to come up against when you're initially building your app, but you might not have thought about the longer term costs associated with growing and just running your business in general. And I don't want to share these costs or talk through the longer term expenses to scare you off in any way, but I do want to set the right expectations so you know and can plan ahead for what's coming. And when you get there, you won't have to be surprised. Make sure you stick around until the end of this video, because we're going to talk about a lot of important stuff as it relates to expenses with your no-code app. We're going to talk about initial investments for maintenance, and the types of expenses you're going to incur as you grow your app. These are the things that are smaller and more niche, and things that you might not have had on your radar quite yet. First, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can launch their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. First things first, we're talking about costs and expenses in this video, but we're not always going to be going into dollar amounts. And that's really important to understand, because costs are going to vary. So we're going to go through the line items, really. Every single component of building and launching your app that you need to be thinking about, that's going to cost you something. But I want you to know that the actual dollar amount is going to vary. And so going into this video, there are three things I want you to be thinking about, and that is cost, time, and quality. So for some things, we're going to do ballpark actual numbers, but keep in mind that for every single thing we talk about, those three factors are important. Okay, you can only have two, and that's a thing that I want you to remember throughout this. So if you want a lower cost for something, then you're either going to have to sacrifice on time, the time it takes to achieve or receive what you're wanting, or you're going to have to sacrifice on quality, the quality of the service or the quality of the product that you are receiving, right? If you want to shorten up your time frame, you're going to have to sacrifice on cost or quality. If you want to have a really high quality product and you want it to cost as little as possible, it's going to take you a long time. So you can start to think about those three things: time, cost, and quality. And for every single expense and line item that we go through in this video, bear that in mind. In doing so, you'll be able to build a more realistic, longer term budget or expense sheet, if you will, for yourself and your own priorities. All that in mind, I want to introduce this model here on the screen for you. So what we're going to do is look at expenses as they relate to different stages and timeframes with your no-code app. So you can see over on the left-hand side here, we have your app stage. So this relates to whether you're at the idea stage, whether you are working towards your pilot launch, whether you are rolling your app out after beta testing. Down at the bottom, we're looking at time. So obviously just how much time has passed. And the reason why I'm including that in there is because I want to give you an ideal time frame to aim for with each of these stages and these costs, although understand that that can vary, again, going back to our time, cost, and quality that we just talked about. Okay. So if you think about this line here as being the progression of your app, right here is our first major milestone. And this is when you're working up to your idea validation. Now, this one is probably the biggest variable in terms of time, because it really depends on your experience in an industry, the insight and knowledge you have, the access to your market, the use cases that your app is for. But I put 1 to 2 months here because we don't want this to go on for too terribly long. If it's taking you a really, really long time to validate your idea, then I would question those initial factors we just talked about. The experience you have, the insight you have, the knowledge of the problem. Are those things there? If it's taking you a really long time, then you might be pursuing the wrong app idea or the wrong solution. Okay, so that's what we're looking at as our first major milestone. Now, after that, once you do have that initial idea validation, and we have other videos on that you can check out for help, but we're then going to go and work towards our pilot launch. This is the first version of your product where you are validating the product itself. So when you validate your idea, you are determining that there is a need for the solution you're going to be creating. When you're validating your product, you are determining if and how that product is viable at a larger scale. Now, the time frame we have here is around 3 months. That's what we like to see when you're using no-code tools. Okay, now after that, you're going to be working towards your beta launch. That's the next major milestone. It should not take you a long time to get from your pilot launch to your beta launch. The real main difference there is with your beta launch, you are determining how your users can find value from your app on a consistent basis. So pilot launch doesn't necessarily involve that consistency or the adoption of your app, whereas the beta launch does. So it shouldn't take you very long to go from pilot to beta. Sometimes that can be as little as a couple of weeks. Now, after your beta launch, you're going to be doing your beta testing, and that can take around 6 weeks, but this is a really big variable. Depending on the feedback you get, that you might go through multiple cycles of beta testing, and that could take many months depending on the feedback you get. So I'm giving you a gauge here, something to aim for, but know that that's a big variable. And then once you roll out your app, so you have determined the product is viable at scale, how it's viable at scale, that it is adoptable and provides value on a consistent basis, right? Then you roll out your app, and you're going to be essentially rolling out your app forever, because your app is never going to be finished or perfect. You should always be iterating. Okay, so those are the time frames and those are the milestones. And now we're going to talk about the costs that are associated with each of those time frames and milestones. So the first milestone we have here is idea validation. That's this initial section here. This doesn't have to cost you a single thing. Again, if you have experience, insight, knowledge related to the industry you're serving, the problem you're solving, you don't need to spend a ton of money. Now, there can be expenses associated with this depending on how you're coming into your app's development. Maybe you don't have that insight and knowledge. Well, you're going to have to get it somehow, and often that's going to involve money. But I suggest that you do come in with an idea that you have experience with. You're going to have a lot easier time gaining that validation. It's going to be a lot shorter of a process, and it's going to be cheaper or ultimately free. After that, however, you're going to move into aiming for your pilot launch. So this is where you're looking at the initial development of your product itself. Now, this is the biggest upfront expense you're likely going to incur. There are some caveats, which we'll talk about later, but the big price tags are normally on the initial product itself. Now, again, keep in mind that time, cost, and quality that we talked about, okay? I'm not going to put dollar amounts on this, and I know you're probably wanting that, but I'm doing it for a reason. It's because I don't want to mislead you, because there are so many variables. That said, we do have a white paper. It's a very in-depth report and cost analysis to help you budget for the development of your no-code app. And it's going to talk about 3 things. So one is, if you are building the app entirely on your own without any outside help at all. So this means that you are tinkering, you're trial and erroring, you're figuring things out on your own, you're learning how to use the tools on your own, you're going through it all in a DIY way. Okay, so the cost and budget expense report that I'm going to give you access to, it's in the description below, but that's going to talk about the DIY and what to expect in terms of time frame and quality with your app as well. Now, it's also going to talk about what we call DFY, done for you. So if you're thinking about outsourcing the development of your no-code app, it's going to give you ballpark numbers to expect for that as well. It's also going to talk about the time and the quality that you can expect to receive and the longer term costs as well if you're outsourcing. Then finally, it's going to talk about what we call the DWY path, the done with you path. It's something that we do with our own entrepreneurs, and it's where they build their own apps, but we're there guiding them, coaching them, training them, mentoring them along the way, so that they can find really the best of both worlds. Okay, so those are things that you have to think about, those three paths. So how you want to build your app. You also, again, have to think about the time, cost, and quality. So with all that being said, that's why we're not going to go into specific numbers on this. But if you head to coachingnocodeapps.com/white-paper, right? coachingnocodeapps.com/white paper, white-paper. You can grab that report and see all the numbers for yourself. Okay, but you do need to look at the initial development as that big initial cost that you're going to incur. Now, I like to call it an investment, not an expense or a cost, because you are investing in something that is ideally going to give you a return, and a long-term return as well. Okay, but that's your big cost that you're going to first be looking at. After that, you also are going to have to think about your initial advertising. Okay, so when you're in this stage, when you're working towards that pilot launch, you should already be starting some of your outreach and marketing, your advertising. Now, depending on the acquisition channel you choose, so the way you find and get your users, your advertising costs can look a lot different. They might be paid or they might not be. You might not have to spend money on advertising. With our own clients, we give them a process that helps them have a group of initial pilot users waiting for when the app is ready without having to invest in advertising. But again, depending on the acquisition channel you're using, you might be using paid ads. Then that's an expense that you're going to have to think about. And you do want to start thinking about it as you're working towards your pilot launch, rather than waiting until later, because you don't want to get to that pilot launch and then not have any users waiting on the other side. Now, there are several things as you're working towards that pilot launch that are also going to come into play that you might not have thought about. And these aren't necessarily big expenses, but they're little ones that can add up. So it's important to be aware of them. So one of these is going to be your domain. Okay, so www.myapp.com, you're going to have to pay for your custom domain. Now, again, these are usually really low costs that you're going to incur. Depending on the domain name, you might find one, or you might really want one that costs a lot more, but usually it's going to be a very small cost. You can go and search on Google domains for the domain name that you want and see exactly how much it's going to cost you. And that's going to be a recurring expense for you generally on an annual basis. After that, I want you to think about email, okay, your email service provider. So you are likely going to be sending regular emails from your app. You might be sending emails that go beyond just the regular usage of your app, like notifications. You may be sending emails to help retain or engage your users. You may be sending marketing emails. Now, if you are using Bubble, then you are by default going to be able to use SendGrid. And with that, you're at least at the time of recording this, you aren't going to have to pay an extra expense just to use what is already kind of built in for you, but you will have to start paying for a higher plan depending on the capacity. So if you are sending out a lot of emails, then you're going to have to, of course, pay for that. So check the plan to see how many are going to be included and whether or not you're going to have to pay for that upfront, because you might not have to, but you also might have an email service provider that you want to use for your email marketing as well. Now, do you need to do that as you're working up towards your pilot launch? I don't think so. I would do that after your beta launch, when you're actually marketing on a more consistent basis. I'd go after lower hanging fruit for your pilot launch and your beta launch. But again, it's a cost that you might start thinking about now, depending on capacity. So I'm putting it here so that you are aware of it. After that, I want you to think about the plugins, the third-party services, the APIs that you might be using. So if you are using any third-party service with your app, if you are using a plugin to connect to a third-party service, or if you're using an API, there might be fees associated with that. This really depends on your app, and it really depends on your needs, and the costs are going to vary tremendously depending on the service that you might need. If your app is going to be very dependent on plugins, third-party services, APIs, or even a single service and API, this might be a larger expense for you. Now, what I see happening very frequently is people know that they're going to be using third-party services, but they don't think about the costs associated with that. Sometimes you're going to have to pay just to use an API, and depending on the API you need, the pricing can add up. Many of them are cheaper free. Some of them are going to be more expensive. Again, it depends on the use case, but I suggest looking into it if you are using APIs, just so that you know what to expect and what to plan for. And finally, in this pilot launch stage, you're going to be looking at your hosting. Okay, now if you're using Bubble to build your no-code app, then you're going to be paying for a Bubble plan. And we're not going to talk about pricing, because if you go to bubble.io/pricing, you can see all of the plan options there, and they'll tell you the most up-to-date and current pricing options. But when you pay that fee on a monthly or an annual basis, that's going to cover your use of the platform, which is giving you the convenience to build and launch and maintain your app at a much lower cost than if you were to outsource to a traditional development agency, for example. It's also going to cover your hosting. So your app is going to be able to run and consistently be available to your users. Okay, so that's going to be included in your Bubble plan, or if you're using a different platform, it'll likely be included in the plan that you're paying for. Now, I'll drop a link in the description below to that Bubble plan pricing page so that you can check those out on your own after this video. Okay, so for this pilot launch stage, we have initial development, initial advertising, potentially your domain name, your email, any plugins or APIs, third-party services that might have fees, your hosting, your Bubble plan in general. So those are the basic costs you can expect up front. And in reality, this is going to take you through to that beta launch stage as well, because usually that transition point is really short. So we'll go ahead and include those all together. All right, so that is going to take us into our next stage here, where you are working towards the ultimate rollout of your app. So again, this is where you are taking feedback from your beta users, and you are essentially iterating the app. You might be expanding the app as you roll it out in full. So this is where things start to become normal, so to speak, when you think of just running your business, where you are running the business, but you're also expanding and growing and taking feedback and working with your users and iterating and all of that. The time frame gauge that we talked about for this stage is a month and a half, but remember, there are tons of variables that can go into that. So that is kind of like the baseline. It can be a lot longer. And in truth, the beta testing and rollout phases can kind of mesh together. It's not like a line in the sand where you go from beta launch to rollout. There's not a switch to flip or everything suddenly changes. it's usually a very gradual transition. And so some of the costs that are associated as you work towards your rollout, they really blend in with your rollout and just with your app and your business's expansion as a whole. So keep that in mind, that what we're about to go through, that they don't fit within a month and a half time frame. They really expand ongoing from there. Okay, so first up in this stage, you're going to be looking at other development costs. Now, there are a couple of variables here too. Remember, I talked about the white paper that I linked to down below, and it talks about those 3 development paths: DIY, do it yourself; DFY, done for you, so outsourcing; or DWY, done with you. Now, depending on the path you're choosing and depending on that time, cost, and quality, the development costs that you're going to incur after you build that initial product, those can really, really vary. So the list that we're going to go through here, these are things that you're going to have to incur in some way, regardless of whether you're outsourcing or whether you're doing these things yourself. And so again, depending on your own priorities and your own path that you're choosing, I want you to either look at these costs that we're about to go through as literal dollar amounts, financial costs that you're going to have to pay, or investments, or even time costs if you're doing some of these things yourself. Okay, so keep those variables in mind, but you're going to have development costs for things like maintaining the app and fixing bugs. It doesn't matter how much testing you do prior to launching. It doesn't matter how many test users you take through the app. There are always going to be bugs and issues and maintenance and little things that you're just going to have to fix and tweak, always, forever. That's just the nature of development and having an app. And so you might be doing that maintenance and that bug fixing, or you might be hiring a junior developer, or maybe you're still working with the agency that you outsourced the initial development of your app to. Maybe you're still working with them and now you're just on a retainer. Okay, but that's a cost that you're going to incur. Another thing to think about in terms of development costs is repaying tech debt. Okay, tech debt is something that you incur knowingly when you are launching a product, or maybe when you are launching a feature. And it's a really common thing that you're going to come up against. And it's essentially a decision that you make. When you are working towards that initial pilot launch, chances are you're going to be moving quickly, and you might not be building the most perfectly developed product in the world, because you're working towards a pilot launch and there's still lots of product validation that you need to go through. Therefore, some of the features, they might not be built in the best way possible. They might not be built in the ways that you are dreaming about and envisioning, but they might be built in a way that allows you to get to your users faster and get that validation faster. And you might do that knowing that if you do get that validation, later on, you're going to have to go back and maybe rework a feature, or maybe build something a little bit differently in the way that you think is more optimized or better. Okay, so that's what tech debt is. Now, after you bring those initial users on board and you get that validation, well, you got to repay that tech debt so that you can continue to scale and provide your users with a great solution and a great experience. And so you're going to have to think about that as a potential cost for, again, either something that you're going to have to pay for, or something that you're going to have to spend time on. After that, you also need to think about new features. As you roll out the app, you're going to be adding new features. You're going to be getting feedback from your users that's going to help you expand your app in a way that's most helpful for them. And you're, of course, going to have to pay for these features. Again, whether you're paying someone else to build them or whether you're paying via your own time. And then the last thing that I want to point out is compliance. Launching an app is never a one and done sort of thing. You don't just click a button to deploy, make it live, and then kind of brush your hands off and are done with it. That's just not the way it goes. There are always changes in technology, in different platforms, in the way users or your target market is going to want to use software. There are changes in laws and regulations and compliance. And these are things that forever you're going to have to mold to. Okay, so I put compliance here because you've been aware of laws likely that have come around or been put into place in recent years. I mean, think about GDPR. You could have an app that's doing very well and that maybe runs primarily on its own. Maybe it's mostly automated for you, but GDPR comes into play. Well, then you're going to have to go back in and change a lot of things, And so those are things that you need to think about. It's not something that's going to be happening every day, but it's a cost that you want to keep in mind so that if and when it does come around, you know to expect it. Finally, in this stage, we're going to talk about wrapping and App Store fees. Now, if you're building a Bubble app, that means you're building a web app. Now, we have a separate video that you can watch on the difference between web apps and native apps and hybrid apps, and really just putting your app into app stores when you're building on Bubble. So you can check that out if you need more information. But as an expense, if you are in the beta stage or the rollout stage, depending on your use case, you might need to wrap your app and put it into app stores. Not everybody needs to do this. Not everybody should do this. But if you have to do this, if it's appropriate for your target market and necessary for the growth of your app and your business, then you may need to wrap your app. When you build a Bubble app, it's a web app. You can use a third-party wrapping service to wrap your web app and make it so that you can put it into app stores and distribute it that way. Now, wrapping the app, again, this can technically be free. You can find resources that help you do it for free, but think about the time, cost, and quality comparison, okay, and what your priorities are, or you can pay someone else to do it for you. All right, so that's going to be an expense. And then putting it into the App Store, go and check the policies, go and check the developer documentation for the store that you want to put it into, because there are going to be costs associated with that. This is information you can really easily find, and to make sure that when you're watching this video, it's relevant and really helpful. We're not going to quote specific dollar amounts because they obviously change. But again, a quick Google search and you'll find the exact numbers that you need. But think about wrapping, putting your app into stores, and then fees associated with keeping it in the app stores. All right, so in this stage where you're going from your beta launch and you're kind of moving into your rollout and continuing forward, you have your development costs for maintenance, general maintenance of the app, bug fixing, you have costs for repaying tech debt, costs for extra features, costs for adjusting to new compliance standards, potential costs for wrapping your app and putting it into app stores. And that, of course, brings us to the rollout stage. Now, on the screen, this looks like the smallest stage. In reality, it's going to be ideally your longest stage, but this is infinite, right? Your app is never finished. It's never perfect. It should always be improving and iterating, and you always want to be scaling your business. And so the costs that are associated with this stage are pretty straightforward. Number one, you're going to continue to incur the costs that we've already gone through, right? You're going to continue paying for your domain name, your email service provider, your plugins, your APIs, your hosting, your development costs. All those things will just become recurring expenses for you in running your business. But you're also going to be looking at scaling your app, and there are specific costs that are associated with that I want to talk about as well. Okay, so before going through this, I do want to give you a caveat. What I don't want you to do is look at the cost of, for example, a bubble plan that you might need a year from now, and look at the dollar amount associated with that, and then have that scare you off from even moving forward in the first place. I say this because I do see it happen pretty frequently. If you look at the costs associated with a scaled business, those numbers are going to look pretty scary to you if you're just starting out. But you have to understand that if you get to the point where those types of costs are necessary for you, then those numbers aren't going to be so scary for you when you're there, because your business will have grown and scaled as well. Okay, so if the numbers for a scaled app look kind of intimidating now, don't let that hold you back, because you're not just going to be at the same place you are now in terms of the return you're getting, which is likely zero right now, but paying a much higher amount. Okay, your business is going to scale, and with that, you have to understand that your expenses are going to scale as well. So the reason why we're going through this is because I want you to know what's possible. And that is really important. Okay. When you are scaling your app, if you need to work up to a higher plan on Bubble, and again, if you just hit the link below in the description to their pricing page, you can see a plan comparison and everything that each plan provides you in terms of the just specifics that you get, capacity and all of that. Okay, so know that as your app scales, your plan can scale as well to support the scale of your app. With that, of course, is going to come a higher expense naturally. Now, on top of that, you may add units of capacity to your app as you scale. And this is a Bubble specific thing, but again, I want to talk about it now because I want you to know what's possible. So server capacity units are the availability of computing power and server resources available to run your app. Now, don't let that intimidate you by how technical it sounds. Essentially, the more complex your app is, the more server capacity units it's going to require. It's important to be strategic about the development of your app. So know that there's not only one way to build an app. There are many ways to build all the things that you are planning to have in your app. Some ways are wrong, some ways are right. The wrong ways could require you to have more server capacity units, whereas building your app in the right ways can eliminate the need for that extra expense. So how you build your app is partially going to dictate this. But as your app scales, even if it is built in the right way, you may need more server capacity units. Now, when this is necessary for your app and business, again, you may end up increasing your plan or jumping up to a higher plan in Bubble, or you may, in the interim, add on extra server capacity units, which you can pay for. Now you can test these with your app before making the extra purchase to make sure that that actually does give you the boost that you need, but that can be an expense as well. And that's okay, right? Remember, if you're at that point where you need something like that, it's a good thing. Okay, so this is not a bad expense, but know that that is a possibility for you so that you can continue that growth down the road. And then lastly, I think it's important to put on here having an expanded team. Regardless of whether you're building the app yourself or you're outsourcing the development in its entirety, you're always going to need people to help you scale and grow your app and your business. And so, for example, our own entrepreneurs, they go through the initial stages themselves so that they can, number one, have control over their app and not have to worry about outsourcing, which a lot of people don't want to do. But number two, have the ability to build that team down the road when they want to and how they want to. It can be really challenging to build an effective team when you have no idea how to properly speak to them. And if you are non-technical and you are trying to build a team of in-house junior developers, for example, or senior developers even, it can be hard for you to know who to hire, and it can be hard to manage them. If you've built your app from the beginning, it takes away a lot of the mystery for you because you're the one who knows your app and you know how it's built. You're going to have an easier time building a team. And with that, you'll probably be able to build a team with a smaller investment from you. Now, that doesn't mean building a team of people who aren't going to serve your business, but if you have the knowledge, then you're going to be able to hire at the right salaries, for example. So anticipate having an investment at this point for building a team. And that can be developers, it can be junior developers, it can be operational team members, it can be customer support, customer service, it could be marketing, it could be sales. It really depends. But as you grow, you're going to need these things because you can't continue to wear all the hats forever if you actually do want to grow. And of course, if you've outsourced your app from the beginning, well, you're going to have to continue either investing in that agency that you paid, or you might have to add other freelancers or agencies onto that, depending on your needs, depending on what the current agency is offering you. So that's going to be, I'm not going to call it an expense, it's going to be an investment because that's going to enable you to continue growing long term. So up in this growth stage, remember we have everything from above, right? All of those expenses that we've already incurred and are just expenses of running a business. And then we have expenses associated with scaling, expenses associated with expanding your team. Okay, so at this point, you should have a pretty good idea of what to anticipate in terms of costs, expenses, investments, and how to think about those depending on which development path you're taking, DIY, DWI, DFY, and what your priorities are in terms of time, cost, and quality. Okay, so remember to plan ahead and know what's possible. That's important. Don't be scared off by the numbers, but know what to anticipate so that when you get there, you can see it as a good thing. Costs that you incur or investments that you have to make, those can correlate with growth. And that's a very good thing. For specific numbers, go ahead and click the link in the description below to head to coachingnocodeapps.com/white-paper. You can get a budget expense breakdown for each of those 3 development paths. It includes comparisons when it comes to time, cost, and quality. So make sure you grab that. It's going to be really helpful for you. And if you're building your app on Bubble, then check out Bubble's pricing page. Now you can always start on a lower plan. So when you're just starting out, you're not getting that return yet, and you want to keep your investment a little bit lower. Well, check out their pricing plan and know, again, as you scale, there are other options available for you to work up to so your app can continue to grow long term. So click those links in the description below to check those out, and then head to the videos on the screen you see here, because those are going to be the next steps that are going to take you towards launching and growing your app and your business. All right, we'll see you there. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.